to the scalable to organizations of any size. Because I realized that in my presentation, talked a lot about Microsoft stuff that's appropriate and necessary when you're talking about 30,000 plus developers. But, you know, for an organization of 10 or 100 or even 1,000 people, probably seem pretty unaffordable. And so I want to make sure I deal with that. So, you know, so just going through the phases, talking about some of the requirements, processes in the simplified training. We say that you need to train as appropriate to your developer population and your technology, and make sure that people do whatever you decide is necessary, and set training thresholds for groups. One of the things that we've already done is release the slide decks that we use for our internal training. They're available for download, so that, you know, so we develop, you know, example of, you know, of the sort of scalability. You know, there is training material out there. There are courses. We've released some for free. There are other things that people can find without having to build their own training curricula. Requirements phase, basically, you know, think about security requirements. You know, the security requirements for any product depend on what it's going to do in part. So we don't say these are the specific security requirements. Building a firewall is different from building a DBMS. You ought to think about security requirements up front. You need to think about bug bar, basically what's the severity and what's the scale for fixing, or the requirement for mandatory fix. Risk assessment, how do you identify the components or products that need especially deep review? Design, thinking about design requirements, especially crypto. We've published crypto guidance. We live, you know, we worry about what happens when the next hash function gets broken. How are we going to respond, you know, and get to secure, you know, to still secure hashes in our products. So those are the sorts of things that we put in the crypto requirement. To give an example, attack surface and defense in depth. You know, use least privilege. Don't open holes in the firewall. Threat modeling important. We've put a lot of stress on it, and I want to say a word about it. Adam Shostak got permission from the authors of the original paper on threat modeling that Microsoft built from early '99 and published it on the SDL blog. You know, and those were our ideas about threat modeling as of January '99. There have been like 4 or 5 iterations of threat modeling. I see. There have been like 4 or 5 iterations of threat modeling in the interim. You know, the book by Swiderski and Snyder, chapters in Michael Howard and Dave LeBlanc's book, et cetera, et cetera. Current thinking about threat modeling is embodied in the SDL threat modeling tool and the associated guidance. And that's actually a process that you can read, understand, and do if you understand your application. Still working to try to make that more usable, more consumable. The threat modeling game, elevation of privilege, helps. But if you're trying to threat model from one of the Writing Secure Code books or from the Swiderski and Snyder book, that's going to be very hard. And that's important, I think, because threat modeling not only tells you where to look for vulnerabilities, also tells you where to look for features absent or incomplete in terms of integrating security into your product. Okay. Implementation, a lot of focus on tools, static analysis, banned APIs, safe options for compiling address space randomization and so on. Verification, you know, testing, dynamic analysis, I mentioned fuzz testing. We do a lot more. We do a lot with fuzzing. We build a lot of custom fuzzers. Introduce those into our tool frameworks. A lot of attention to attack surface. Are the access control lists set correctly? Is the system secure by default? Release phase, I haven't talked much. I referred to the audit. We use what's called a final security review, which is basically asking the question, did the product team implement the SDL as they were supposed to? It's not doing all the security at the end. It's not a final penetration test necessarily, although we may factor a penetration test into the FSR for some products. But in general, what we're trying to do, say the requirements are the requirements. We want the product teams to do them, and if the SDL is good, then the product will be secure for its environment as defined by the risk assessment. That's a matter that I think is important for groups thinking about adopting the process. I don't think you're going to take every developer in your organization and make them a security expert. Building a threat modeling tool that can be used by non-security people is part of that. Having specific requirements is part of that. You need access to security resources somewhere, but you're not going to make every DBMS designer into a security expert. So what we try to do is to give people prescriptive guidance, says here are the things you ought to do, and then make sure that they've done those things. Obviously there's variation. It's going to be more depth, more security experts, more penetration testing, more design and code review for a Windows release than for a dogs and cats release. But the key point is to enable everybody in the development organization to meet the security requirements, not hope that you're going to have a handful of security experts make the entire thing secure. Sort of the ultimate rejection of the old Secure Windows Initiative model. And then, because perfect security isn't something that the state of the art knows how to achieve at this point, we still require, as part of the SDL, that you have a security response plan. And that basically says, know how you're going to fix a bug, know how you're going to release a fix, know how you're going to respond to an emergency. Register with the central response team so that if they get a bug report in your product, they know how to find you. And that's what's behind the things like security bulletins and security advisories that we release. Okay. So objections. The SDL, the specific tools that we release, with one exception, are certainly for Windows. But look at the general process as defined and simplified, and we think those are techniques that can be applied to other platforms, to other operating systems, to other kinds of development. And in fact, one of the companies that we've worked with on their application of the SDL does a lot of non-Windows and has built their process largely emulating the SDL. So simplified is the way to get that abstract approach that you can figure out how to do this for non-Microsoft platforms. We started out with shrink-wrap products, Windows, Office, SQL. Over time, we've added coverage of line of business applications, actually added online service fairly early. There are online service requirements in the recent releases. There are online service tools that we use. Things like Bing and Live apply the SDL both for native code, managed code, web applications, and so on. I talked about Agile. I talked about tools. The big question is, that is resources. How do you do that? We have a lot of infrastructure, but there are a lot of pieces that you can pick up and use. We've seen smaller organizations adopt the SDL, and we're pretty comfortable that it's doable by picking up the free resources, by starting out with the basics, threat model, configuration, banned APIs, some sort of static analysis tool, a simple fuzzer, response process, and some training. That may sound like a lot. It's sort of the basics of what we do. We think it's about what you need to get into. We'll talk about that more in question. Okay, I want to do 3 more slides in probably 3 minutes. Who uses the SDL? We don't know. We do. But, if you go to the website and download, you have to click through a EULA, but you don't have to register. We have worked with some big organizations. Some of them have gone public about working with us. Two of the visible ones are Adobe and Cisco that have acknowledged working with us in building their secure development processes. Not identically the SDL, but acknowledged working with us. We've seen a survey that said there was a significant fraction of adoption of the SDL and SDL for Agile. But one of the things we really would like to do is find out who's using the SDL and hear their stories about what works and what doesn't. So if you are, come see me after the session. We're really interested in that. I have had the experience recently having people I've never heard of, I've never met from organizations I've never heard of, walk up to me and say, we're using the SDL and I have a question. And so that's sort of gratifying. It makes me realize, gee, we've got some users out there. I'd like to know who they are and what they're finding. Okay. Resources, the free downloads, this is by history, but if you look to the right, this gives you a sense of where things stand today. So the releases that you can use include the guidance for simplified SDL, SDL 4.1 as we do it, and SDL for Agile, which is included in 4.1. All right, so 5 is out there, and I think that's not on the slide. But SDL Classic, SDL for Agile, and Simplified are out there in terms of guidance. The released Visual Studio process templates for SDL and SDL for Agile, and then a fuzzing tool, the threat modeling tool, and a binary analyzer to make sure you've used the right build options. Threat modeling tool is the tool we've released that's applicable outside the Microsoft environment. You can threat model your Linux or Macintosh or iPhone or whatever app, although obviously the threat modeling tool itself runs on Windows. And we think that's a good way to get started. And I am not going to go through these slides. So just the summary slide. You understand the importance of building secure software, or you wouldn't be at the conference. It costs something. We know that. We believe the SDL is effective. We're seeing organizations adopt it beyond Microsoft. We're not sure how many yet. We believe that it can be applied beyond Microsoft. We've made a lot of resources freely available to help you use the SDL. We're going to do more of that. And we'd encourage you to try them, provide feedback, and see what your experience is. So with that, I wanted to end with the links, and I want to take questions. Yes?
Well, I would just make a comment. You said that one of the companies that came out and said that they're using your SDL is Adobe. And Adobe is probably the most valued software the last 1 year, with many zero-day vulnerabilities that were mostly discovered in the wild, exploited, and were later patched by Adobe. So how do these two come together?
So how do I square